So you've already heard quite a lot this morning and this afternoon about upstream thinking. What I'm aiming to cover in my talk is more about the delivery, how it works in practice. So as Martin and Lawrence outlined earlier, the Upstream Thinking project, as it runs at the moment, is a result of the PR09, which is the Price Review 09, and runs from 2010 to 2015. So within that, delivery of those outputs is being managed, if you like, through a whole range of partners. And South West Water, as all of us are very proud of the fact that it's a partnership that involves public, private and third sector organisations. The strategy, as Martin detailed earlier, is very much about protecting water quality as well as water resource. And the total value of the current round, the interventions accumulate to in the region of £10 million of investment. So this map, possibly Martin showed it earlier, shows collectively the catchment management work that's going on across the region through Upstream Thinking delivery. And the work that West Country Rivers Trust are doing are the areas in green, but also the area to the east, which is the River Otter catchment, where it was being run by FWAG, but ultimately, I'm sure you know, went to administration, and now we've absorbed that into our own projects. So the map also shows the connectivity between where works are being carried out and the abstraction points and the water treatment works of South West Water, so you can see how that equates. Before I go into detail on what West Country Rivers Trust are delivering, I think it's fair to mention and recognise the work of the other partners. Without going into a huge amount of detail, the Mires project, aiming to restore the hydrology and to restore that function, so trying to reverse the decline and the drying out of the peat to improve water storage capacity. And there's a huge amount of work that's already been achieved up until work up to 2010 in the first phase, which was started also along with Exeter National Park. A number of surveys and ditching for re-wetting was carried out, which came to over 600 hectares of surveys and 64 kilometres of ditches. So that's making great headway. Also now we're also working, I say we, the Upstream Thinking group, are also doing work on Dartmoor to achieve the same sort of ends. Bearing in mind that there's a whole range of issues there, partnerships and interests that need to be taken account of. On Dartmoor you also have the military, it goes into the military zone, and there's also things like the archaeology and the heritage which needs to be taken account of. The other two main partners are the Devon and Cornwall Wildlife Trusts. Devon are running the Working Wetlands group. I know Mark's here somewhere. Hi. And so we actually overlap in the headwaters of the Tamar, and their thrust central idea really is for the protection of the coal measures, which are a species-rich grassland, which is a threatened habitat. It's an area that's also suffered through intensification from agriculture and draining for agricultural use. And Devon Wildlife Trust, through the Upstream Thinking project, their team of advisors will give help, advice, training and support. And what they're aiming to do is to bring that habitat back into good management and good condition. And they're also facilitators, if you like, with working with one of the other partners, which is Natural England, to bring in ELS and HLS agri-environment scheme funding. And I'm pretty sure that they've already exceeded some of the targets already for that. Without going into a huge amount of detail, both the Mires projects and Devon Wildlife Trust are case studies in the delegate pack, so there's a lot more facts and figures included in there, and obviously websites if you want to read more. The other partner is Cornwall Wildlife Trust, which are way down in West Cornwall, and they're working in an area that's surrounding Drift Reservoir. Again, working with farms and smallholders to try and encourage them for the uptake of agri-environment streams, and also helping with further advice, farm plans, soil plans, etc., for good management and also protecting water quality. And they've done some excellent work on tracing and trying to mitigate pesticide issues. So this map details more the areas that West Country Rivers Trust are working in for our catchment management work. The catchment management work is practical works that are operating on the ground at the moment. We're also working with South West Water for the catchment investigations, which are a further 17 catchments which we're researching, if you like, and carrying out scoping studies for potential future round in PR14. The areas that West Country Rivers Trust are working in, which cover from the east Wimbleball Reservoir, the Tamar and the Foy, also cover the three strategic reservoirs for South West Water, which supply the majority of the South West. So the West Country Rivers Trust have 5 target catchments, 6 now with the Otter. Within the Tamar, that also encompasses the Upper Tamar Lakes and Roadford Reservoir. They fall within the Greater Tamar, if you like. Our total budget for farm interventions is in the region of £2 million, and that standard intervention is at 50%. That is to say, we will offer a grant and we expect the farmer to invest a similar amount to make that investment and that commitment. The types of works that we carry out, we don't have a definitive list. It's very much tailored to the farm business, to their location. But some of the main interventions we carry out are obviously repeat works of fencing, buffering watercourses, livestock control, access restrictions, and yard infrastructure, be that slurry, silage, manure, housing, sheds, etc. And South West Water, by their own admittance, don't have a history of working with farmers at grassroots level, but the West Country Rivers Trust has done for many years, and also knows a lot of the farmers and those regions quite well through previous projects and previous initiatives. So, going back to our well-used map, the images on the left represent poor practice or bad practice, if you like, on farm, in the landscape, in the catchment. And as Nick was explaining earlier, we know many of those main issues. We can identify many of those main issues and sources. So to begin with, we're looking at the source, be that point source or diffuse pollution sources, which are at the start of the water quality concern. Primarily, it's nutrients and soil mobilisation. So we know when our team of advisors are out on the ground, they know what they're looking for, they know how to approach that. So we have to start with the source, and then from the source we can identify the pathway and the connections of how that's being mobilised and how that's connecting with the watercourse. If we can understand the connectivity and give help and advice and mitigation, then what we aim to do is to disrupt and hopefully end those connections so that we are removing those sources from the receptor. And ultimately, the river, the stream, the watercourses act as a receptor. They're not only taking on those pollutants and issues in that site, it's also being transported downstream. And so the impacts, say, of pesticides will be felt further down the stream. They ultimately need to be dealt with by the water company at the treatment works, but they will also affect the biodiversity, water quality, etc., for the whole of that catchment. So, in terms of West Country Rivers Trust catchment management process, our initial process is to first engage with the farmers. We need to identify who owns what, and that might be cold calling, it might be going on knocking on doors, it might be we tend to arrange an initial catchment meeting, an informal evening with farmers, word of mouth, invite the main landowners and get them around for a pint in the pub and explain to the captive audience what you're aiming to achieve, and to try and engage them and get their interest at the first level. The other thing that we're very keen to stress is the fact that our approach is 100% confidential. It's also 100% voluntary. If they decide they're not interested, they can walk away. We have no bearing on them, but often you'll find that peer pressure, and we have already seen this now that we're 2 years in, that farmers initially declined, not interested, are now coming back to us and saying, actually, I am interested. So the initial action by our advisors is to, once they've identified who's interested, is to arrange a visit. They spend an hour, maybe 2-3 hours, depending on the size of the operation, sitting, talking to the farmer about his farming operation, his aspirations, where he's aiming to go, and from there they can they'll carry out a whole farm survey, and they'll produce a farm plan that's a tailored, integrated farm management plan specifically targeted at that farm. And it will also need to take into consideration what their plans are. You know, do they have family that are intending to continue? Are they intending to expand? A lot of things that need to be taken into account. So the types of things that we're finding are the types of photos you've already seen. I mean, absolutely, with the farmer's permission, we undertake a survey, we'll walk around the entire site, it's completely confidential. We've already pointed out that we're not in any shape or form there to report them, we're there to help them, it's confidential. And the other thing to point out is that we're making recommendations for the protection of the raw water quality, but except for a very, very few instances, these people are not operating illegally. They are within the regulatory restrictions, if you like. They're not breaking the law. If they are breaking the law, if they have a pollution incident or a very severe issue, we will make no bones about pointing that out and pointing out how they can seek help. We won't fund them to get out of a problem where they're currently polluting and causing an actual pollution incident. So those are the types of things we're finding on the ground. It's quite common: poached ground, unrestricted livestock access, runoff, perhaps inappropriate practices, timeliness, maybe just caught out by the weather. But we're finding them across the region, and ultimately, of course, that connects to the waterways, the watercourses, and these are all photos that we've taken in the catchments we're working on. So you can see, again, the main issues are soil mobilisation, nutrient enrichment that's being moved and spread downstream. And that enrichment also causes issues with algae and algae growth, which South West Water can ultimately quantify in terms of what it costs them, increased cost for water treatment, for cleaning it up. As Nick was explaining, the increased amount of sludge extraction and removal, the costs involved in that. We also have, when we're going out on catchment in a sort of targeted approach, if you like, is that we can also use the data that we've obtained through South West Water, through the Environment Agency, and any modelling or mapping works that we've done prior to that stage to help us focus in on what we may see as problem areas. So the next stage, we've carried out a farm visit. We draft up a fully integrated farm management plan for the farmer, and we identify opportunities in there for them to make improvements, but we always stress the win-win opportunities, as Dylan was describing earlier. We make it as useful as possible for them to envisage how it can improve their farm business as well as improve the water quality. If they want to go ahead, they are requested to obtain market prices, a minimum of 3 like-for-like quotes, which they obtain from contractors to carry out the works that we've identified. Once they've obtained those, we as a team, the Upstream Thinking advisors and team in the office will sit down once a month, and we will go through any potential grant offers, and then we discuss the priority, if you like. You evaluate them to see what's the best spend for the funds available, and if we're happy to go ahead, we make an offer, which is standard intervention of 50%. There is 2 legal documents that we need to proceed with at that stage. There's actually 3 levels. If it's a small grant of under £1,000, we offer a small grant agreement, which is a relatively simple, short document, 3 to 4 pages. If it is between £1,000 and £5,000, we raise a larger conditional grant agreement, which is about 15 pages long. It can appear daunting. Farmers often go off and consider it or seek advice, maybe from an agent, maybe from a lawyer. And that is essentially a legal agreement between ourselves, South West Water, and the farmer. If the works exceed, if the grant exceeds £5,000, sorry, move too far, we also need a deed of covenant. So a deed of covenant ties in that legal interest on the property. So the terms of the agreement, the terms of the grant, maybe 10 years, maybe 25 years, depending on the infrastructure investment. And that lodges a legal agreement, and that ultimately is registered with the land registry. So should the farmer move, should they sell, those terms and conditions remain registered against that particular property. So I've got very little time left, the food is telling me. I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of examples. So a grant under £5,000 identified a need to reduce livestock access. So they had a grant for £5,000. Total works came to about in the region of £10,000. There was no grant, there was no deed required on that grant because it was under 5,000, but they were able to successfully put in some fencing, exclude livestock, and protect that watercourse. Larger projects over £5,000. This one was a livestock yard where it was open, so there was increased rainfall, adding to slurry, and it also meant it was he was able to, in the future, bring his livestock in and overwinter them. Covered area. That was a much larger project, a much larger build. He had a grant for £13,000, but the total works were 26. So obviously the farmer there has to make quite an investment himself. And because of the scale of the grant, there was a deed required with that, which is ultimately lodged with the land registry. The other outcome that we've had is last year the catchment sensitive farming officer on the Tamar was actually very well stretched. He was working in more than one catchment, and so we worked with catchment sensitive farming to deliver information, advice and visits. And so a farm that was visited by one of our advisors was actually then given advice because he preferred to go for a catchment sensitive farming grant. He was successful in his CSF grant, and he carried out the works with his own money, and CSF didn't decide to take up the upstream thinking. That's his personal choice. As I say, it's completely voluntary, but obviously he has less legal tie-in over that and for less duration. But it also meant that the advice that we've given has also helped in delivering raw water quality improvements on the ground and make good use of the available funds in catchment. So on completion, hopefully we've got a much nicer picture of conditions on the ground. There is a suite of investigations and monitoring and sampling going on, so that in terms of quantity and quality we can to be a bit more defined about those improvements. That's something that Adrian is going to talk about shortly. And very briefly, in the 2 years that the project's been working, these maps show the inset is Wimbledon in the X. But these maps show the areas of land that have been farms that have been engaged in year 1 in yellow, in year 2 in red, and catchment sensitive farming areas that we've also visited and given advice on as well in purple. So in 2 years, bearing in mind we're approximately halfway through the project in current phase, we've visited nearly 200 farms. That's individual farms, that's not farm visits. Each farm may take 5, 10, 15 visits over the time of the project. So they've received farm plans and grant-aided projects. So we've seen at least £1 million of spend in grants, which has seen at least another £1 million match from farmers on that as well. So ultimately our aim for the future is to move from the situation on the left to the situation on the right to improve water quality, and we look forward to potential future round of PR14. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. Lawrence gave me a really challenging remit for this presentation. He wanted state-of-the-art understanding of the efficacy of measures at just about every scale on the planet, and also some background information on the DTC. And in the short slot that we've got, that's clearly not possible. But I'm hoping just to deliver just a few key headline messages as we work through the next 20 minutes or so. So, information on the efficacy of measures for controlling diffuse water pollution from agriculture, as we know, can be collected at a range of scales, moving from experimental plot or laboratory facilities through to field scale experiments, farm scale experiments, and ultimately up to catchment scale experiments. And as we know, as we scale up, the level of realism increases dramatically. That's what we want. We're trying to capture real-world situations, real-world performance of measures. But of course, unfortunately, this is what scares us as scientists. As we scale up, the capacity to introduce experimental boundaries declines sharply. And of course, frequently we need those boundaries to help us interpret the outcomes that we're actually monitoring. And I think in this context, of course, it's always important to remember the principal scale of reporting for the WFD is over here. It's the landscape scale, the water body scale. So with the growing interest in the efficacy of mitigation measures that are available through various initiatives and delivery schemes, various dictionaries of best management practice have been produced over recent years. For instance, the DEFRA user guide, which was released about 5 or 6 years ago, detailing around 44 mitigation measures, and as we know, that's recently been updated by the DEFRA user guide, which now details in excess of 80 mitigation measures, preferred mitigation measures for controlling diffuse pollution from agriculture. But I think the important thing for me as a scientist is that the empirical evidence for the performance of many of the measures that are listed in these dictionaries of best management practice is either very scant or in fact totally absent in many cases. And so the approach used by many of these dictionaries of best management is actually to sit experts around a table and to elicit some expert opinion with regard to the performance of those measures. As an example, this table just lists some efficacy values for a range of DEFRA user guide mitigation measures, in this case for controlling sediment loss to watercourses, for arable farming systems, for grass farming systems, and for two key soil types, clay loams and sandy loams. These efficacy values, as you can see, range. So we have very low values in terms of reciting problematic gateways, right up to quite significant values assigned to more severe measures such as converting arable land to grassland. Now these measures and their efficacy values are actually used in recent policy support work. But again, it's important to note where possible we base these values on extraction of information from existing international literature. But in many cases there is very little or no evidence on the performance of these measures, empirical evidence. And so again, we rely upon elicitation of expert opinion. Most of the existing evidence on the performance of mitigation measures has been assembled at experimental plot scale. A very good example is the ongoing DEFRA-funded MOPS project, mitigation of phosphorus and sediment. It's currently in its second phase, and during its phase 1, it assessed a number of mitigation options which are listed here for cereal tillage systems at 3 experimental sites across the country. So we had ADAS Rosemont, the Severn Trent Water site at Hattons, and the Allerton Trust site at Loddington in the Midlands. And as an example, the MOPS project demonstrated very clearly at plot scale the capacity to have a significant impact in reducing runoff, sediment and macronutrient losses using a very simple mitigation measure, which is the use of this duck's foot implement to disrupt tram lines. That's important. We have lots of evidence which demonstrates that tramline wheelings can control delivery of diffuse pollution from cereal fields because of the associated compaction. And we can see very clearly here those plots which were disrupted managed to experience losses of runoff, sediment, macronutrients, which were very similar to the control plots which had no tram lines present at all. Some recent DEFRA-funded work that I've been involved with has produced some new evidence on the efficacy of 6-metre riparian buffers in arable landscapes, 10 experimental sites in these catchments across England. And for this work we used a magnetic tracing procedure which I've been heavily involved in developing over recent years. But again, the key point which I want to stress, look at the ranges in the efficacy of 6-metre riparian buffers in these different agricultural landscapes. Very significant ranges. In the Avon, performance or efficacy ranging from 2 to 98%. And I think a point I wanted to stress was that actually we need to get comfortable with the noise in the empirical evidence base. The performance of mitigation measures is very site-specific and is controlled by a multitude of factors. In this case, for buffer strips, it might be the presence of concentrated flow pathways, issues with compaction due to farm trafficking, or issues associated with vegetation management. But let's not get too unsettled by the noise in the empirical data. It's the direction of change, really, that we're most interested in. Positive change, positive direction of movement, and as Dylan would say, we move forward on that basis, no regrets. Now, given the need for improved empirical information on the performance and mitigation strategies at water body scale, the DEFRA Demonstration Test Catchment platform has been established in 3 sentinel catchments. We've got the Eden in the north, the Wensum in the east, the Hampshire Avon in the south. It's currently a 5-year funded project with some elements running to 2014, but in fact some elements are now running to 2017, and we're in discussions to try to extend more of the funding to the 2017 timeline. Nationally, it currently has a budget in excess of £8 million, and one of the things I wanted to flag up is that actually it's done a fantastic job in pulling together a range of lead research groups in terms of testing measures and understanding diffuse pollution. We have over 40 organisations involved. And in my leadership of the Hampshire Avon platform, I took the decision to expand some of our work westwards to monitor the outcomes of the targeted on-farm intervention being delivered by the West Country Rivers Trust, which we've heard about so much today. So broadly speaking, the experimental design that we're using for DTC is to align with the Environment Agency and the Rivers Trust to develop linked on-farm intervention, monitoring and modelling. So DTC aims to deliver improved empirical information on the performance of targeted on-farm measures at edge of field or edge of farm, to link that information to empirical evidence on the performance or outcomes at target subcatchment scale, and then to take that improved empirical evidence to feed into modelling frameworks to extrapolate that experience both across the DTCs. They're very large catchments in their own rights. The Avon covers 1,700 square kilometres, for instance, but also for extrapolation more strategically for policy support. And But DTC is using the internationally recognised before-after control impact experimental design. That has two versions. One version where we monitor outcomes in both control and manipulated target subcatchments. We collect baseline information for both. We then introduce measures in our manipulated area, continue the monitoring of the outcomes at the outfalls of both of those. Or a second version, before-after control impact of version 2, where we monitor upstream and downstream inputs and outputs of a significant mitigation feature, which might, for instance, be a constructed wetland or a set of modulated features that are in sequence. And for the demonstration test catchment platform, we are using both versions of the BACI approach. Thank you, I'll slow down. Okay, for the DTC, there is a focus on monitoring the outcomes for water quality, and this slide lists some of the determinants that we are monitoring. So various forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, we're looking at sediment, and a whole range of other determinants as well. But I think critically we do recognise that monitoring positive outcomes using these conventional metrics at subcatchment scale in response to targeted on-farm intervention at timescales of less than 10 to 20 years is quite challenging. And the reason being, we know that through statistical power analysis of existing water quality data sets. So detecting change with these at subcatchment scale in the short term is a major challenge. So in DTC, we've been thinking about timelines for detecting outcomes and corresponding metrics that might be useful in conjunction with those timelines. And we've rationalised our thinking into 3 key timelines, 1 to 2 years, an intermediate timeline of say 5 to 10 years, and a longer time frame of 10 to 20 years. And you'll see that beside each of those timelines we've got some metrics that we feel are useful for reporting positive outcomes in response to the targeted on-farm intervention. So in the short time frame, social measures and information on farm business structure, uptake of measures, positive attitudes of farmers for engagement. In the medium time frame, looking at changes in source apportionment of key pollution. And then in the longer time frame, that's where we see the conventional metrics, water quality and biological quality, coming into their own in the most robust sense. It doesn't mean that we can't use them beforehand, but I think we have to accept that the evidence in the short time frame will always be open to challenge. This doesn't concern us because the way that we've rationalised our thinking is in terms of what we're calling a catchment toolkit for monitoring the outcomes of targeted on-farm intervention. It's a Lego brick structure, and collectively it provides weight of evidence with respect to the outcomes of the targeted on-farm intervention. So we have a series of Lego bricks which reflect monitored outcomes. They could be surface water quality, groundwater quality, biological quality, for example. And then, in conjunction with the 3 basic timelines that I identified in the previous slide, we're beginning to think about some of the metrics which we might use to report positive outcomes in response to the PES or the targeted on-farm intervention. So if we take surface water quality in the short term, we're focusing very much on looking at changes in pollutant mobilisation. In the medium term, we're undertaking empirical repeat source apportionment. We know from CSF that that can provide positive information in terms of positive impact at water body scale. And then we see the conventional metrics, water quality, biological quality, becoming more useful in the most robust sense, bearing in mind that this evidence must be compelling, it's always going to be open to challenge, coming online in the longer term. So in the short time frame, we're collecting a lot of social data. We're undertaking very detailed farm business surveys to understand how much farmers appreciate that they're part of the problem, their receptiveness to advice, their receptiveness to changing business practice and introducing measures on their land. And we're undertaking this using detailed field walks and one-to-one farmer interviews. Although using water quality conventional data to detect positive outcomes in the short time frame is challenged, part of that challenge reflects the fact that much of the data is collected infrequently and you can miss very important components of the water quality response. Now, in DTC, because we're well funded, we've been able to deploy state-of-the-art in situ nutrient analyzers which collect very high resolution information. Some fractions are collected every 10 minutes or so. And what we're beginning to see is actually, using some of the conventional water quality metrics, our confidence in terms of detecting change in the short term for particular aspects of the response, particularly frequency and duration of the highest peaks, is certainly beginning to shine through, and there is similar evidence coming from catchment work over in Ireland. So we're beginning to become more confident about using some of the conventional metrics for water quality for demonstrating positive outcomes in the shorter time frame, for the simple reason that we are using better, higher resolution technology. If we turn to measuring the aquatic biology response, again, our biologists tell us that using the conventional metrics, community information, is going to be challenging in terms of demonstrating positive response to targeted on-farm intervention in the shorter time frames. But because of that, we're focusing much more on ecosystem process rates. So we're looking at using things like litter decomposition bags, algal growth tiles, again, for the simple reason that we know that the process rates are more likely to detect positive outcomes in response to the targeted intervention in the shorter time frames. And of course, releasing positive information, exceptionally important, the proof of concept for maintaining interest from funders, and critically, of course, for continuing to engage the catchment stakeholders in this process. Modelling, as we've seen, is essential as a component of the modelling of the catchment toolkit. So we're using a range of models and using SciMap and including SciMap and Psychic to help with the spatial targeting of our measures in our manipulated catchments. But we're also using alternative tools to help us select measures, to optimise the selection of available measures, and also to help us with assessing what the technically feasible reductions might be using a particular mitigation programme. And for that work, we're using the new ADAS Farm Scoper tool. And this, you'll be pleased to know, is my final slide. And I just wanted to say that we are confident that the direction of change is good in terms of the environmental responses to targeted on-farm intervention, and I hope that I'm not giving a negative message here at all. That's not my aim. I'm just saying that we need to be clever about the metrics which we use to make sure that we are releasing more positive information to keep people engaged. But as ever, there are some elephants in the room, and I'll just flag up two that jump out at me. Firstly, the continued failure to consider the colloidal fraction in assessing the performance of mitigation measures, given that much of our pollution is moving in conjunction with that fraction. Most of the efficacy evidence is based on clay, silt and sand fractions, etc. And the other issue that I wanted to raise was that we've seen a great deal about risk modelling and pressure modelling. We have pressure models with mitigation measures built into them to assess what might be technically feasible. But of course, given that some of this work is driven by WFD targets, we need coupled modelling frameworks which follow this through to the biological endpoints for things like fish and fly life. ADAS is in the fortunate position to be releasing a new modelling tool which does this for sediment in the next few weeks, but there remains an ongoing challenge to develop these coupled modelling frameworks for multiple pollutants. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, bon après-midi, mesdames, messieurs, good afternoon. Welcome to the end of the session. I work for about 9 different organisations, including a co-director of the new Bristol Avon Rivers Trust, which I'm very proud of. But today I'm with the Environment Agency, which means my presentation might be a little more boring than usual, talking about what water companies do. I'm sure on Channel 1 you can get a translation from Wiltshire to English as well, by the way. Why an ecosystem approach? Well, we have to. I just want to paint a bigger context here. At global scale, the UN's Millennium Ecosystem Assessment assessed habitats at global scale, and about 60% of habitats are degraded or seriously degraded, whilst we reach 7 billion. So there's this conflict of rising population demand, declining resources, and of course the additional pressures of climate change. So really just to put that in as a big context, and that water, land and water, are seriously pressured resources, and that can only compound. There are also obligations that say we have to undertake an ecosystem approach. All signatories of the Convention on Biological Diversity are obliged to, have agreed to, implement an ecosystem approach. That's obviously happening rather slowly. In the UK, there is government direction of travel. White paper, a natural environment white paper published last year that talks about mainstreaming the value of nature. The green paper in Wales, much the same. And this, the Natural Environment White Paper says that the government wants this to be the first generation to leave the natural environment of England in a better state than it inherited. I've not spoken to our George Osborne, our Chancellor, but I don't think he's read that bit. There are other various policy documents across the UK that talk about integrating wider social and environmental benefits. So this is absolutely cross-government, this. This isn't just the Environment Department out on a limb. This is cross-government. And there are a whole range of social inclusion, localism issues. And, you know, echoing Arlen, it is all about people. That is the transition. It's not technical work that looks at the environment as some sort of external thing. It's about people and the way it affects us. The next slides are very boring because they're not mine. This is a little bit of a summary of some aspects of that natural environment white paper. Lots of words, you can read them later online. But really highlighting 3 things, the 3 central threads of the natural environment white paper. One is that ecosystems really matter to all dimensions of society. 2, we must learn to value them appropriately. And 3, we must mainstream them across all areas of policy and practice. This is a picture from that white paper, and you can see it makes the links between different habitat types and the way they interact and the services we get. So we're moving away from managing habitat A in one way, habitat B in another, habitat C in another, to thinking how they work together to produce benefits or disbenefits, depending. So all about integration. Late last year we also had, in the UK, a white paper on water. Again, there's lots of words there. I don't try and read them, they're all a bit dull. But essentially it's that same triad of recognising the importance, the value of the water environment. And very strong words for a government white paper, acknowledging and reversing the damage we've done to water ecosystems. The second one is very much echoing that essence of valuing appropriately and taking a catchment approach, so thinking in a connected way. And the third is that third strand of the white paper about mainstreaming, taking into the mainstream across policy areas with various specific initiatives. So there's pretty consistent government direction from the top down. So moving to the main theme of the question Lawrence set me, which is what are water companies doing? Well, I'm going to focus on England and Wales, and the 2 best known are Upstream Thinking, about which I'll say no more because you've heard plenty, and scamp that United Utilities are doing that I thought you would have heard plenty about but haven't. So I'm not going to talk about them, but they are in many ways exemplars of the way catchments are being managed for the benefit of water, biodiversity and a range of other stacked benefits. The third sort of leader of the pack is over where I live actually, Wessex Water. Wessex Water is the water service provider for that area. And it's really kept its light under a bushel. Neil, where are you? I was talking to in Claverton down with your office there, and that they want to just really communicate a little better what they've done in the current investment round of water industry investment. So they've got a big catchment management programme. They're looking at a range of things: management for nitrates, pesticides, phosphates. They're doing river restoration to mitigate poor flows because there's a huge amount of groundwater abstraction, a lot of chalk and limestone in that area. Nutrient offsetting, biodiversity offsetting, and no idea what that word is there, but I obviously knew when I typed it. But actually they're looking at the efficacy of planning on a catchment scale. So there's a lot going on catchment management. These are really probably the three biggest, the three main leaders around the UK, but other water companies also are exploring in the current investment round, very much gearing up to look. And I just want to look at three quick examples: Welsh Water, Yorkshire Water, Anglian Water. Welsh Water, this was given to me, this information and the slides were given to me by Welsh Water for today. They're looking to identify causes of raw water quality concern, additional sub-catchment investigations to inform the next round of water industry investment. And here's some examples of what they're going to be doing. They're impounding reservoirs, the reservoirs that manage the flows which are abstracted lower down. They have the traditional problems of nutrient enrichment, acidification. They're uplands. Here on the Alwyn Conway, here is a nice plot showing, or a nasty plot, showing rising colour as the peat is degrading as a result of drainage. So they've got the data to then put a programme in. And this lovely red reservoir takes eroded sandstone whenever it rains. So there's a bunch of problems that they've got the data for. And in the next round, intend to move into catchment management in much the same way as we've seen with Upstream Thinking. Yorkshire Water, up in the top right of the country, acknowledging that Ofwat is the financial regulator for the water industry, is trying to nudge them to focus on outcomes. And so they're investing in research. Don't worry about the details there, but investing in research to develop an evidence base to know where to do a catchment programme. And then wherever Martin is, Love Every Drop, Anglian Water, is a programme developed by Anglian Water in the east of the country with 100 sustainability commitments, including words like using ecosystem services to reduce flood risk, investment in sewage treatment. A big programme of sustainable drainage systems, again thinking in terms of catchment functions rather than just downstream clean-up, and water-friendly farming. So moving in the direction that we've seen today. There are one or two other companies I could have picked on that are doing bits and bobs, but that's really a flavour of where the water industry is today. A couple of policy messages. Well, I didn't know that Chris Ryder was going to be here, so I've given him licence to tell me it's completely wrong. These are some notes I made when I was chairing a conference last week. Chris, in a presentation at the conference, acknowledged the lead taken by water companies, noting a transition to paid ecosystem services, so beginning to bring the value of ecosystems into what we do, emphasising catchment management, encouraging a more catchment ecosystem-based approach, acknowledging that since this isn't familiar terrain, familiar cost-benefit tools probably won't be adequate. So we're moving into an unknown, but encouraging companies to be proactive in PR14. Just try it. JFDI, as we say in the British saying. I'll explain that in French over dinner. But to share knowledge and to work out what it means together. Very clear messages, consistent with the white papers, right from the top of government. The Ofwat, the financial regulator for the water industry, well, Martin couldn't be here today, so I emailed him to say, what would you say if you were here? And here are his messages. Acknowledging the lead taken by the three water companies, South West Water, Wessex, United Utilities, encouraging more companies to consider payment for ecosystem services in the next round of water industry investment. And whilst Ofwat is still evolving its policy stance on catchment management, it's clear that it'll be asking for an outcome-based approach, and that it will obviously want companies to take their customers with them in terms of supporting, but do focus on the outcome, not just the tried and tested, somewhat narrow approaches. So catchment approach is very much encouraged from the top down of government. Where are we today? It's an evolving picture. There are clearly some leaders. Some are exploring the terrain, some have still to engage, but the signals are that everyone will engage in the next round. Some questions remain, so there is research going on and a lot of exploration beneath that level. Some resolution has to go on as well. For example, where does the polluter pays principle end? People doing what they have to do, what they're compelled to do. Where does common law right begin? Beneficiaries actually have some rights, so don't have to pay for everything. Where does PES kick in? Where does the beneficiary pays and the provider gets principle kick in relative to those? And what are the win-wins? In other words, the non-polluter benefits, saving money on pesticides, saving on sort of waste arisings and all the rest of it. And actually, in principle, we understand that quite well, but in practice, we've got to work it out on a very context-specific basis. So we're living, all of a sudden, in the last rounds of water industry investment, we kind of had fixed processes and protocols to do things. Now we just know we need more complicated outcomes, but that are cheaper and that work with natural processes, rather than fixing one problem by causing many others by accident. So a much more integrated approach. Which brings me to my sort of really closing conclusions. We are living in a changing world, a very profoundly changing world. On that, I mean, Dylan introduced today by talking about the turning of the tide. In my other work, in my sort of television, radio and writing world, I'm talking more about an ecosystem revolution, because we are really facing a revolution as profound as the Industrial Revolution, which taught us how to turn natural resources into money whilst liquidating natural resources. Now we're trying to reinvent an economy and a way of living that generates wealth and food at the same time as protecting and ideally regenerating the ecosystems that actually underpin that in the future. It is as profound a revolution as that, and we're probably 50 years into that revolution. So water is very much at the forefront of a very deep cultural transition, and certainly where I work in arid parts of the world, you can see it absolutely in your face. If you get it wrong, people die or suffer far more directly. If we ever get to the Vive la Révolution bit with the guillotine, by the way, I've got lists of people. Okay. So, which brings us back to the role of the Rivers Trusts. The NGO sector has in many ways been a leader of this transition. It has filled a democratic gap. It exists and is successful because no one else is doing it. In the last major agricultural revolution in the UK, after the end of the Second World War, there was lots of free farm advice. Now there isn't free farm advice. So people like West Country Rivers Trust, Severn Rivers Trust, whichever river trust, are filling a gap that we've sort of created by underinvestment. So NGOs are very much leading a social transformation. Business too, the water industry, the Unilevers of this world driving Marine Stewardship Council, the Kingfisher Group driving Forest Stewardship Council, very much driving a business transition. Government too is setting these big principles whilst trying not to be prescriptive about the minute details, just knowing where we've got to get to. And academics too are sort of generating the knowledge to help us do it in the right way and to audit that we've done it in the right way. So all in society are leading. It's not just a top-down government thing here. And we live in a unique space in time as well, in that all that top-down guidance from government, from Ofwat, from DEFRA, other government units, is giving space to form partnerships, to innovate, to learn. And I think it's very much beholden to all those with an interest in what we're doing today to recognise that it is almost a unique space to be encouraged to focus on the outcome, make mistakes, but take customers with us as far as possible. We're moving into a very different world, and water is very much, as a critical resource, one of the leading ways in which we'll find that new space. So there's a bit of the dull stuff about water companies and a little bit of philosophising from me, but I hope that that sort of conveyed something. I don't know what it's conveyed, but something.
Hi, Claire McCampbell from Devon. It was a question for Adrian on the monitoring. Do you know the scale of pollutant spikes that we're missing on traditional monitoring, the scale of that? And given Stuart's question earlier about the necessity of monitoring to underpin all of this, have we got any sort of proposal of what kind of monitoring we need in catchments to be able to do the regulatory bit, to be able to underpin the polluter pays, and to be able to kick off the PES markets? Actually, let's have it to all three of you. What kind of budget are we talking, and a few of the components? And it ties on to a conversation I was having with Kate about United Utilities, and it's who's going to pay for this monitoring, and it underpins everything we need to do. So how much is it going to cost, and what does it look like?
Right. Are we allowed to go to dinner or not? There is a vast amount of literature out there that has done a lot of statistical analysis comparing more detailed work on the collection of water quality data versus regular but infrequent sampling, GQA or something similar to that. Perhaps the best way of summarising that is to say, if you're interested in fluxes, the errors that can be generated on the basis of, say, monthly sampling are in the order of hundreds of % if you're trying to characterise your response. So the significance of doing the more detailed work is very important if you want accurate catchment response. It becomes even more important if you're trying to be an expert in detecting positive outcomes in response to targeted intervention. I think the other issue for me is what are our key drivers here? The requirements of the water company in terms of their treatment plant are potentially quite different to, are we doing enough to improve ecological status? I'm involved in a very large project in Canada which is following this process through to drinking water quality, but there the pressure is wildfire, a very significant environmental issue. So we substitute the farming for the wildfire. It's having a devastating impact on risk to drinking water supplies for major cities. And as I understand it, if your plant is set up to deal with NTUs of 1 to 2, if it just rises very slightly, even to 3 or 4, you're in major difficulty. If your plant is set up differently to deal with higher NTUs from the off, then it's probably not going to be an issue. So very subtle changes in things like NTU can have a devastating impact on the water treatment process. So that end point is incredibly sensitive. If we're driven by ecological status, the harsh reality is the reductions necessary in quite a few of our pollutants are going to be substantial. If we turn to my area, which is largely focused on sediment, if we want to improve the habitat status for fish and fly life, in many catchments we'll be looking at reductions of 70 or 80%. That's going to be really challenging given the pressures on our landscape in many areas. What does the good work cost? Well, the existing budget for DTC was flashed up there, and our Secretariat is here at the front, Bob, who's done a fantastic job for us in terms of promoting the DTC community. Good science to provide compelling evidence for proof of concept does not come cheap. It doesn't have to be undertaken everywhere, it can be very targeted, and DTC is part of that equation, and it's fantastic to link up with South West Water, and I'm confident that we can gather that compelling evidence.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no pressure question there, Claire, thanks for that. We need more monitoring, but actually we need the right monitoring. And I go back to when we got interested in sort of sediment and nutrients back in the 90s, and I made myself very unpopular. I'm really good at that, by suggesting that annual average data was rubbish. Just dipping a bucket 12 times in the river, probably when it's not raining and the sampler didn't want to be there, would not catch the peaks. So we need to understand the process by which our pollutants get there, use the latest technology and time the monitoring. It might be cheaper, I don't know. We need to do the research, but we don't need to be hamstrung by old-fashioned ways of thinking about how you monitor water quality. Intervention measures, which is also one of the real biggies here, I don't believe need to be more costly. The Loddington farm that Adrian mentioned, they've managed to double their wheat output whilst restoring bird levels back to the pre-70s crash, simply by being very spatially context-specific about where they did things. So instead of a subsidy being paid to a farmer to do stuff over a big area, actually to use that specifically to the kind of areas that Nick's slide showed. What are the hotspots? Where do you actually need to intervene? And use the intelligence and the local knowledge and the passion of the local farmers, rather than just give them a cheque to go do stuff over a large area. So some things may be more expensive, but we just need to be smarter, I think.
I'm just going to add to that, just to keep it within the context of if you suddenly decide to do a huge amount of monitoring and it takes the wrong scale or the wrong strategy, you could end up where you spend so much money on monitoring, you then have no money left to actually do the approach. Or you might find that you know policy changes or the direction changes. So I think it just needs to look at the bigger picture and find the right approach at the right level.
Oui, ma question est pour Hazel. Je n'ai
You take that.
Oui, donc je n'ai peut-être pas tout compris, mais j'aurais voulu savoir si vous pouviez me dire comment il est possible de donner des aides aux agriculteurs sur des actions qui, me semble-t-il, sont obligatoires du fait de la réglementation européenne. Vous avez parlé des aides pour les couvertures des sols après les cultures, par exemple, ou pour les stockages de lisier. Et je pensais que ce n'était pas possible de pouvoir donner des aides sur des choses qui étaient obligatoires au niveau européen.
Right. If I think I've understood the question correctly, if we find what we would deem to be breaches of regulations, breaches of statutory duties, what we're able to do is inform the farmers that they have these statutory limits or statutory rules that they're currently operating outside of, and that that's a significant risk in terms of being regulated and fined, and then we direct them to the authorities to work to remedy those risks. That's basically it, but we won't fund them. We won't fund them to rectify a legal breach, though. And we can talk about it more later. I can speak French after 2 pints of beer. So.
Thank you. Clive Harwood, Anglian Water. My question is directed to Mark Everard, but I'd also like the views of the other panellists if you could. And my question is, Mark, your presentation was very interesting in terms of your perspective of water companies, NGOs and government taking forward. However, you didn't mention what the regulators are doing and what their views are. And I wondered if you'd like to expand on that, and perhaps the panel can add their views as to what they feel the regulators should be doing as well.
I'm quite good at statements that limit my career, so I must be really careful here. The regulator is in an evolutionary place, moving from siloed regulation, ring-fenced budgets that constrain action and thinking to really rather traditional ways of doing things, and is in the same process of transition as companies, NGOs, government, in trying to grapple with the ecosystem approach and multi-benefit outcomes. Some of the legacy regulation does inhibit that, where there's a ring-fenced budget for this purpose and this purpose only, so you have to play slightly dirty games. What I generally find is that my colleagues in the areas who go to farms and can see where subsidies are working and subsidies aren't working are just sort of saying, oh, this is great, can we do what makes common sense? Whereas at the policy level, people are grappling with the fact that there is a sort of a reconstruction of the policy environment. So my role in the Environment Agency, who I work for a number of days a week, but not all of them, is I'm interfacing with government, and I'm helping with DEF with thinking around this, and I'm interfacing with people in the policy areas to try to help them think more broadly. A lot of the names on my guillotine list come from that category.
I was just going to say, within the Upstream Thinking project, the Environment Agency team locally, specifically on the Tamar more so, they're working within the partnership. We also know, obviously, that they're active within the catchment. They have their own works that they're carrying out. They're doing walkover surveys, etc. It does happen, and it has done, where they make referrals to individuals who are not at the prosecution level but need help to avoid prosecution, shall we say. They do get signposted to us, and where we can help, we do. But that's when it's not at a stage of it going legal. It's prior to that. We've also stressed repeatedly that we won't report farmers if we come across something which is an out-and-out pollution, and we won't report them. We give them as much advice and help, point them in the right direction. And that might actually be to say, look, the best thing you can do is call in yourself, report yourself, ask for help, and be proactive about it. I suppose in the 2 years we've had probably only one farmer who kind of has played that scenario where he's ping-ponged between ourselves and the Environment Agency to play each other off against each other, but it's just one, and you're always going to get individuals who perhaps push the system to the limit.
So perhaps one final question.
Thank you, James Grisham from Natural England. I was delighted that someone brought up the issue of regulation and integration with regulation, all that sort of stuff. I think is really important, and first layer of how maybe farmers abide by cost compliance and all this sort of other requirements. But I also wonder about other aspects of value for money and integration. The reality is that CSF, for example, there's flag activity, or the catchment sensitive farming now works in 70 catchments across the country. How can we make sure that we've got this situation where we get the best bang for our PES buck? So, we've got stuff happening on agri-environment, ELS, HLS. We've got stuff happening for catchment-sensitive farming. Now we've got this opportunity, it seems to me, for this extra funding. How can we make absolutely sure, firstly, that there is integration between these different programs that are going on, and secondly, making the most of this new buck that we've got?
Well, I think the P word comes in here, partnerships, because if it's one regulator doing something in one way with one bit of budget, you'll probably get one answer. But what we've heard all through the day is the way that people have got together to recognise, for example, if they want to put a bit of woodland in there that might do something for Water Framework Directive, that will also do something for amenity, do something for breaking down heat islands. It will do things for breaking storm energy. It will deliver many benefits. So if you are interested in putting in woodland, for example, for a Water Framework Directive, talk to other people, because that woodland will do other things. And it's the other organisations that will see and realise those benefits. And we have to turn...
About delivery. How do we make sure that there is a person going down the farm drive that's saying, here's woodland, and the farmer says, right, cool, I'll plant some woodland. And then we can talk about how the values of that are integrated elsewhere. That we can do that thing about, if we can get the wood planted there, then go. Apologies. I was just more interested in delivery and how we integrate that delivery side of things, and maybe make it transparent to the farmer client, possibly.
Well, the West Country Rivers Trust have form on this in terms of stacking Forest Com money on top of other forms of money on top of what they're already doing. So, Hazel, can I pass over to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I was going to say is within the wider partnership of Upstream Thinking, for example, the Wildlife Trust particularly are one means of bringing in, Mark will give you the figures, but I think that currently on Upstream Thinking it's in excess of £5 million that they've managed to bring into the working wetlands through ELS and HLS and OELS schemes, which they're facilitating, and they're bringing that in. So they're obviously working, I mean, Natural England are a partner, Environment Agency a partner on theirs. So they're obviously working closely. Sorry, I'm being waved at. I'll slow down. On our own projects, obviously on the Tamar, we're working with catchment sensitive farming. We met just recently with Paul Allen, regionally, the areas that we're working at the moment and the areas where we're carrying out catchment investigations. So that's the 5 current and 17 future catchments. We're already speaking with catchment sensitive farming about who's working where and to signpost farmers to what is available in there. And that's if you go back to the original meeting we had a long time ago in March 2010, when we sat down, one of the objectives through the project was to actually signpost to farmers what else is out there, and obviously that's changing all the time, but that is already incorporated in the approach.
One final.
It was just a comment on James's question, because the answer, I suppose, is part of what Dylan and Arlen presented earlier. Is there's the 3 component parts. We need a geographical area in which is delineated, and we know everybody is operating in. We've committed to piloting the catchment pilots, and we're working out, is that the right level to integrate actors, that being public, so the government and its agencies, and also working out then how to involve the water companies and other PES providers. So that's a trial. The catchment approach is a trial to trying to establish that geographical area and whether it is a means of integration. And separately, we have been doing quite a bit of work in DEFRA on trying to set out a framework for addressing agriculture's impact on water, and trying to split into what are those basic measures that should be enforcing the polluter pays baseline. Once we have those clearly defined, we then link that clearly to what the regulator, these are the measures that the regulator will be going out with service level agreements saying these are the things you will be advising farmers on and enforcing. And then beyond that, we are going to define those measures that fit into future agri-environment agreements, subject to CAP reform negotiations, and those are targeted in catchments, in areas that drain to water bodies of the highest societal importance. So that would be government setting out what it's doing in a special area, and then it will be that's part of the toolbox and for others to feed into. But greater transparency on what we're doing will enable others to see where we're not acting and that they can take a role. So this should all, subject to ministerial discussions, etc., be being consulted on over the coming year and up and going once we have the review of the catchment approach and before we launch the next rural development programme. There you go.
Okay, thank you. That's a nice challenging question to end. I think we're going to wrap up now. So thanks again to all the speakers. That's great. I'm going to hand over to Lawrence in a moment, but first just going to ask Chris Ryder, who's head of water quality at Exeter, just to give a few observations on the workshop.
Hi. Just to put myself in context, I guess I'm pleased and proud to say that the policy area that I own is one where I and my team are seriously trying to apply the approach set out in 2 white papers of stimulating paid ecosystem services as an addition to the way we address the policy issues that we are faced with. And I guess that what we have done by way of adopting a catchment-based approach and seeking to pilot it in a number of catchments is a part of that turning of the tide that Dylan mentioned at the beginning of the day. I would say there are 4 big shifts in approach that are involved in that. One is about aiming to deliver the outcomes, the improvements that we want. That's the key to what we're doing. And it's not about just delivering processes. So we don't throw our hats in the air because we delivered river basin management plans to some deadline or other. But the thing to celebrate is as we progress to understanding what's needed and working out how to deliver it. Change number 1. Change number 2 is understanding that the Environment Agency should not aim to deliver everything as our delivery body, and the game is changing in the direction of finding ways to achieve things through others. That's change number 2. Change number 3 is bottom up, not top down. So we're no longer saying the way to deliver the things we want is by handing down templates that tell everybody the same way to do it everywhere. It's now about enabling things to happen differently and in the right way in different places. And then the 4th thing would be engaging with stakeholders in a new way, not just handing down things that are going to happen, but sharing evidence, building up relations with stakeholders, building partnerships, using the evidence to drive the right things happening in the right places, delivering multiple benefits, and understanding what we're achieving as we do that so that we know whether it's taking us where we want to go. 4 rather different approaches, a challenge to change that way of doing things, but that's the right way. So really, the almost fabulous thing about today, doesn't it strike you that just about everything we've heard today is about a large number of people coming together collectively and demonstrating in most of the things that they've been saying and showing us that there is actually a model for what I've just said we're trying to do, and that there just is a way of doing it. So this afternoon we had Martin explaining, amongst other things, yes, those 13 farms up above your reservoir that have been fixed. This is getting the right thing to happen in the right place. And Martin, you talked about the recipe being different depending on where it needs to be applied, what the situation is there. This is getting the right things to happen in the right places. You're showing that it can be done. Then there was Nick. One of the things he said was, you must know the problem and where it's coming from so that you can target interventions. That fitted with our new approach rather nicely. And again, there was a way of delivering this. Adrian was telling us, yes, the measures that we are applying will work. This is you couldn't summarise everything that Adrian said in a second, but there was a message that things work, but there's a lot of challenges about understanding how we need to make everything work fully, and that will take time. So, on the whole, we're in the right place and going in the right direction. There's a huge challenge working together collectively to make all this work. We don't underestimate the challenges. There are some we all have to take away. I suppose the ones particularly for me and for DEFRA are about building that integrated approach so that in some way we find ways of not having quite so many people with asks of land managers and other players in the world out there. We try and integrate our messages, and I suppose the other things I've mentioned, there are a lot of them, but making sure, as Claire was mentioning just now in some way, that we ensure that observation of the key regulations that everybody should be following, both in agriculture and in other sectors, is happening, because that's the polluter pays bit that needs to be at the root of everything that we're doing. And also looking at agriculture again, making sure from where we sit that the importance of negotiating a CAP that contains things that will enable the things we need to do. Many other things, so definitely challenges for DEFRA. But out of today, a real feel that there is a collective understanding of what we need to do and of how we need to do it, and a feeling that it's onward and upward from here. So thanks to the Rivers Trust for this event, which I think has been really, really encouraging.
I'll just, before everyone disperses in just a few minutes, because I know that people probably have to disappear off, basically Chris pulled out most of the things that I was going to summarise, which is great, but I just wanted to say 2 points really from the whole day, and all these points. It seems to be all about the people. It's all about getting those partnerships working, understanding, and really speaking the same language, because we all come from different silos. And then the second thing is that massive point of learning by doing and having a go and trying to learn by those experiences, adaptive management, whatever you call it. But it's the importance of those sorts of things so we can start gathering some of that information. And hopefully things like the website and the guides and the case studies will be a way of increasing that knowledge. But really all I wanted to do is thank you all for coming, and the speakers and yourselves for attending, and humouring really Martin, Dylan and myself, who constantly give 15-minute presentations trying to cover this, and really you've had 8 hours of it. So thank you for that. Just a few last points of clarifying. There's a Rivers Trust meeting that will happen over where we had lunch in the next sort of 15-20 minutes. For all those people departing to Buckwell Lodge, the coach is going at 5:30, so make sure you're outside getting onto that. If you're joining us tomorrow on the field trip and you're on Coach 2, which you should know if you're on Coach 2, we'll be getting ready at 8:30 and the coach will be departing at 9 o'clock. If you don't know where you're supposed to be for the field trip, ask Viv, she's over there in the pink. There's dinner tonight, which is at 7:30 for 8 o'clock, so do come back. And please make sure you drop off your headsets on the way out. Don't take them with you because they won't be that useful. But dinner is at the Buckwell Lodge, so at 7:30 for 8 o'clock. But as I said, thank you so much for coming. I think I've gained a lot, and I hope you have too. So a round of applause for everyone.